Hi, A Course in Miracles talks about there only being two emotions, fear and love. But the Course's way isn't to focus on love. And a lot of that is because the Course is about undoing, first of all, finding and then undoing our resistances to love. And this video will explore three main reasons that we have this resistance to experiencing love. And I'll be using an essay called Tea and Sympathy that I wrote for this book, Jung and A Course in Miracles. So I'll be reading extracts from the book, and yeah, that'll be the main gist of this video. So here we go. Shortly after the death of Queen Elizabeth II, I came across an extract from a book called War Doctor: Surgery on the Front Line. It's a memoir by trauma surgeon David Knott. It described the time he sat next to the Queen for lunch. Knott had returned from volunteering in war-torn Aleppo and was having difficulty coping with regular life back home. He received an invitation to attend a special lunch at Buckingham Palace, and a summary of his account follows. On the day he walked through the palace gates, Knott was struck by the contrast of the illustrious surroundings with war-ravaged Aleppo. Then, entering a reception room where he stood with other guests, the splendour and hospitality added a sense of guilt. How could he be enjoying such comfort while his friends were still suffering overseas? That's the kind of thing that was running through his head. As all of this played on Knott's mind, he became, quote, perilously close to a panic attack. Barely holding himself together, Knott took his place at the dining table to the left of the Queen. As custom dictated, the Queen spent half an hour talking to the person seated to her right. Then she turned to Knott. He was struggling to talk at all. He didn't know what to say. But then the Queen asked where he was from. He replied he had just come back from Aleppo. Oh, she said. And what was that like? As Knott's mind filled with the tragedy and horror of that place, his bottom lip trembled and he felt the urge to burst into tears. The Queen looked at him quizzically, then immediately summed up the situation. She touched Knott's hand, opened a small silver box in front of her, and took out a dog biscuit. Breaking the biscuit in two, she gave half to Knott, saying, "These are for the dogs." The Queen led the way, talking about her dogs, their names and ages, and she and Knott fed and petted them under the table. So that's the handy thing about having corgis. They can fit under the table nicely around your feet, and you can chat to them while you have your dinner. Gradually, Knott's anxiety disappeared. Reading Knott's story, I was touched by Queen Elizabeth's sensitivity and kindness, and reflected on how it's often when we're in the presence of a truly empathetic, non-judgmental person that we finally, often acutely, touch on a pain we've been struggling to process. Knott has his own theory on why this is the case, as seen in the following extract about the moment his bottom lip trembled. I quote, "I don't know why it happened then, or why it should have been the Queen who bridged the dam, or breached the dam. Perhaps it was because she is the mother of the nation, and I had lost my own mother." End of quote. I'm sure the Queen's status as mother of the nation was part of the equation. But what is it exactly about that comforting presence that breaches the dam? This essay will explore this question, considering principles from A Course in Miracles, and look at how the answers inform the Course's particular path of healing and approach to love. So now we'll explore why Knott was so touched by the Queen's sympathy and why it was that broke the dam. subtitle Recalling Our Innocence. This is a quote from Nott. The contrast between those gilded walls and the ravaged streets of Aleppo began to do weird things to my head, wrote Nott about passing through the gates of the palace. And this is my reflection now. It was a contrast between heaven and hell. Nott felt a fraud, guilty, for being in the warm, hospitable environment. The thing about war is that you're exposed to the full horror of the ego's competitive thought system of one or the other, of kill or be killed. There is no observance of the everyday social contracts which protect us from the darker side of human nature. And so, as the selfishness of the ego thought system is laid bare before us, so too is our own shame and guilt associated with the ego. Whatever disturbs us on the outside is a symbolic representation of the ego's dark philosophy we all sometimes live by, albeit unconsciously, and it is brutal, though some forms are more subtle than others. But it is also a false representation of our true self, capital S. It isn't who we really are. And so, when we are welcomed by someone without reservation or condemnation, we can be overcome with emotion at what they reflect back to us, our innocence. As the Course's psychotherapy pamphlet says, and who could weep but for his innocence? The pain isn't so much about what we have experienced in the past, but is related to the non-judgmental acceptance someone shows us in the present. Another example of pain associated with remembrance of our innocence comes from Kenneth Wapnick's book, Absence from Felicity, the story of Helen Schuttman and her scribing of A Course in Miracles. So, in that book, the following is a Helen's account of a series of visions she had of a priestess, her higher self, and how she was at first afraid that the priestess would look at her with condemnation. The first of the series began with a picture of an unrecognised female figure, heavily draped and kneeling with bowed head. Thick chains were twisted around her wrists and ankles. This figure came to me almost daily for several weeks, each time with a noticeable change. The chains began to drop away, and she started to raise her head. At last, she stood up very slowly, with only a short, unconnected length of chain still tied to her left wrist. The fire blazed with unaccustomed brightness as she rose. I was quite unprepared for the intensity of my emotional reaction to her. When she first raised her eyes and looked at me, I was terribly afraid. I was sure she would be angry and expected that her eyes would be filled with condemnation and disdain. That's the end of the quote. Helen is describing what the Course calls the shame of guilt, the shame of having turned our back on God's love in preference for a special, separate existence. But the vision continues, and Helen encounters another source of pain, one more associated with heartache than fear. Quote, I kept my head turned away the first few times I saw her after she stood up, but finally made up my mind to look straight at her face. When I did, I burst into tears. Her face was gentle and full of compassion, and her eyes were beyond description. The best word I could find in describing them to Bill was innocent. She had never seen what I was afraid she would find in me. She knew nothing about me that warranted condemnation. Yet she did know many things I had never known, or at least had entirely forgotten. I loved her so much that I literally fell on my knees in front of her. So, the face of innocence, when somebody looks at us without any condemnation, though we feel so guilty and shameful, as Nott did, about being in the palace even while his friends were still fighting at Aleppo. when someone looks at us with that non-condemnation, we just fall to pieces because we really touch on that yearning for our innocence. Just as recalling our innocence is painful, so too is recalling the love of God, the oneness we once experienced. So the resistance to meeting that pain was made clear to me in a dream. Now, I won't go on with the whole dream, it's a bit lengthy. You might get bored. So I'll skip to the bit where in the dream, let's just say there's a figure of a loving God, a totally loving God, someone who represents that. And there's somebody else who is like a helper, a friendly helper. And they're saying to me in the dream, they're taking my hand and they're saying, come on, let's go meet God. Come say hello to God. And in the dream, I'm really resistant. I'm pulling away. I'm like, no, there is a real terror about it, but it's not a terror of a fearful God. It's not about a fear of God. I'll explain with the dream. So here we go. My new friend looked at me and said, let's say hello to that God figure. He went to take my hand and I immediately withdrew from him. I was filled with a dread of meeting God face to face, but it wasn't because I thought I'd be judged. Instead, the thought of it seemed to hint on a heartache so profound that I knew I'd crumble in a heap if I touched on it. I didn't think I could cope. And that is really how I felt in the dream. It was a heartache that it was touching on. And we'll go on. The heartache associated with recalling this loving God is reflected in the following passage from the Course about a forgotten song. This is the quote from the Course. Listen, perhaps you catch a hint of an ancient state not quite forgotten, dim perhaps, and yet not altogether unfamiliar, like a song whose name is long forgotten and the circumstances in which you heard completely unremembered. Not the whole song has stayed with you, but just a little wisp of melody, attached not to a person or a place or anything in particular. But you remember from just this little part how lovely was the song, how wonderful the setting where you heard it, and how you loved those who were there and listened with you. The notes are nothing, yet you have kept them with you, not for themselves, but as a soft reminder of what would make you weep if you remembered how dear it was to you. So I think that expresses the heartache associated with touching on that memory of love. So we have the heartache associated with touching on the memory or the recognition from someone else of our innocence, but we also have the heartache associated with touching on the memory of that love from which we stem. Okay, so we've covered two resistances there. Let's go on. Now the subtitle is Embarrassed by Love. Is it possible that we resist connecting with love because we find it embarrassing? Our rejection of love is another sort of heartache, as illustrated in the following extract from Absence from Felicity again. Here Ken Wapnick describes how when Helen was complaining to him that Jesus didn't help her enough, he suggested she take her issues straight to Jesus, and the answer she received brought her to tears. Here's a quote from that book. Finally, I suggested to Helen that she might do better with this situation if she brought up her anger directly to Jesus, rather than using me as a middleman. She finally agreed, and so quieted her mind sufficiently to ask Jesus very specifically, "Why have you not helped me more?" His answer, hardly what she was expecting, was also very specific. "I cannot help you more because you are so ashamed of me." Wow. Recognizing the truth of Jesus' words, Helen broke down in tears. Wouldn't we all if Jesus said that to us? That's the end of the quote. What Jesus meant was that Helen was ashamed of her love for him. This is because the ego is powerless in the face of God's love, and so interprets loving feelings as a weakness, something to be embarrassed by. Says the Course, I quote, "In honesty, is it not harder for you to say, 'I love,' than 'I hate'? You associate love with weakness and hatred with strength, and your own real power seems to you as your real weakness. For you could not control your joyous response to the call of love if you heard it, and the whole world you thought you made would vanish." End of quote. In the Fear of Redemption section, the Course explains that we fear God's love because we know that in its presence we would be inextricably drawn to it, losing our special ego self. The earthly reflection of the ego's fear of such vulnerability is when we feel ashamed of our emotional neediness towards others, our objects of special love. I saw a clear illustration of this shame on social media recently. In a home video, a toddler wearing diapers, or nappies if you're in Australia, stands motionless in a hallway watching his older brother and sister head out the front screen door to go to school. As his siblings move out of his line of vision, he takes a few rapid steps towards the door, then stops abruptly, hitting his face with both hands. So just really hitting his face, covering his eyes. Says the narrator of the video, he's not just upset, he's upset that he's upset. That's this kind of shame in a nutshell. The narrator then says something very interesting. This is every villain's origin story. That's what he said. The narrator is the toddler in the video, now an adult, and he doesn't appear to be an evil villain. But if you scan the series of Marvel comics, you'll see the connection he's talking about. As the Course says, because of our ego's inherent weakness in the face of love, we believe, this is a quote now, believe that magnitude lies in defiance and that attack is grandeur, end of quote. In those moments when we don't want to appear or feel weak by listening to ourself, capital S, which would be a loving response, we're likely to act rashly, take unnecessary risks, defy rules, or act inconsiderately, all in the name of keeping away from the love that renders our ego, our specialness, void. And now this brings up the issue of projection. Having rejected love, we'll project the responsibility for our pain onto others, believing that they have deprived us of love, that they have rejected us. As Jesus said to Helen about her earlier question to him, if you are ashamed of me, or embarrassed by love, in other words, you will project and make it impossible for me to reach you. So you will project believing that Jesus is embarrassed by you or rejecting you and is out of reach. If he feels out of reach, then he can't reach us because there will be some anger we have towards him for feeling abandoned by him. And so we won't be really open to him reaching us. We'll be pushing him away because that's what we do when we feel, you imagine a teenager when they feel rejected or something, or yourself even when you feel rejected, the first thing you want to do is hit out at that person or push them away, especially if they come back towards you. There's that, you really want them, but you're angry at them for exposing your vulnerability, but also because in your eyes they have abandoned you before, that you hit them away. So how can Jesus help us if we feel that he has abandoned us? Continuing on. In other words, here we go, I said it all in here. In other words, if we deny Jesus' love, we'll project the responsibility for love's absence onto him, believing he has deprived us of it. This closes our mind off to his guidance. We're not receptive to it because we don't believe it's being given to us. An important consequence of such projection also relates to self-sabotage. Okay, we're nearing the end now, so hang in there. In the Bible, Jesus appears to give special attention to the lowly and the downtrodden. And we all come to a course or look, our Judeo-Christian or the Judeo-Christian heritage is really prevalent throughout the world, and the idea of Jesus favouring the downtrodden and the poor is also prevalent. And the Course tries to explain that Jesus doesn't have favourites. The downtrodden and the poor are no different to let's say, the highly successful in the world, because form doesn't matter. The Jesus of the Course, as represented in the Course, cares about the underlying need that everybody shares, and that is to know that they are forgiven, that they're not shameful or guilty. But anyway, it is difficult to shake off this idea, particularly if we're in our ego, that Jesus does favour the suffering, the lowly, and the poor. Now, here's a consequence of that unconscious bias. If we have an unconscious belief that we're not experiencing Jesus' love because he overlooks us, then that can lead to a seemingly inexplicable attraction to increasing or maintaining our suffering. And then I have a kind of thing that can run through our head. What do we have to do to get him to notice us? This dynamic can also be reflected in our relationships with parents and other significant authority figures. So this can explain the strange, like, repetition compulsion that Freud talked about, where we keep finding ourselves in circumstances where we repeat things that aren't necessarily helpful to us. It's like a form of self-sabotage. We keep doing things that incur the wrath of others. We keep doing things where we lose all our money, and we keep doing things, we're just repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And it can be we're trying to get something from others. We're trying to fulfill a need, something we didn't get previously. And if we feel abandoned by Jesus, we might think that, wow, I really have to go become the lowest of the low. I have to be knocked about from all directions to be one of his favoured ones, or for him to see my tears, and then maybe he'll notice me. So yeah, that's another difficulty about believing that Jesus has rejected us. It's really that we have rejected him and feel so guilty and shameful about it. Okay, so where does all of this lead us? So this is the last section, called Approaching Love, Baby Steps. From the Course's standpoint, trying to approach love directly doesn't consider our resistance to love. Based on the discussion that we've just had, we've seen several aspects of this resistance. We are afraid of losing our special separate ego self in the presence of love, and therefore we think defiance is strength. We don't want to feel weak, which is really just, we equate the humility of our ego, or of being humble, choosing the second place to gain the first, as to our ego. That's a weakness. We want to be the first. And so we don't want to feel that weakness of our ego in love's presence. And so we become that defiant kind of, no, I'm not going to talk to Jesus. I'm not going to offer this particular forgiveness lesson up to the Holy Spirit for correction. And I want to feel strong, and strong in my ego. So that's one. We are afraid of losing that special ego self. Another is there is heartache associated with recalling our innocence and God's love, and we don't want to touch on it. It is painful, actually. And we don't want to experience, this is the other one, number 3, we don't want to experience the shame of guilt for having turned our back on love, an act we'd recall if we found ourselves once again in love's presence. So, a couple of heartaches, innocence, about our innocence and about love's presence, and the whole defiance factor. We want to be an ego. For these reasons, the Course's path to happiness and peace involves helping us move beyond such resistance, the obstacles to experiencing love. These obstacles are gradually removed via the Course's process of forgiveness, whereby we let go of our identification with shame and guilt. In Helen's priestess visions, the chains attached to the priestess represented Helen's particular grievances that were limiting her union with her higher self. As Helen wrote of the point where she fell on her knees with love for the priestess, and I quote again from Absence from Felicity, "Then I tried unsuccessfully to unite with her as she stood facing me, either by slipping over to her side or drawing her to mine. I noticed that she still had a few chains around her wrists. That, I felt, was probably the problem." End of quote. Through a daily practice of forgiveness, we gradually experience the truth of the Course's atonement principle, which states that we haven't really rejected love because the impossible can't occur. Working through our forgiveness issues, we slowly approach love, loosening our chains whilst respecting our fear. So there you go. There's the answer to being able to approach love according to A Course in Miracles. It's by working on our daily forgiveness lessons, which undo the shame and guilt. And gradually we can approach love, taking into account our grief over the love that we feel we have lost, over the innocence that we feel we have lost, and the need, the ego specialness need that has us wanting to defy that love because we feel that we would be weak in its presence, and we would, our ego would just disappear. I hope this has been of some help to you. So the Course's way of approaching love is to undo the interference, which is all of our judgments about people, about ourselves, about the world. And practicing forgiveness is the way to undo those judgments and to approach love in a way that doesn't work against our resistance. So we're not fighting ourselves or feeling pressure. If we go against ourselves, we must feel an amount of pressure in doing something if we're fighting ourselves. So the gentle way, according to the Course, is to practice forgiveness. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you again. Bye-bye.